Final Fantasy. A series known to many as the quintessential JRPG, this series is one of the oldest still-going franchises in video game history. With the franchise celebrating its 30th anniversary this year, the games have been known for many wonderful stories, hours of fun gameplay, and intriguing and deep characters. As a fan of the series, I've decided to cover every entry I am capable of playing, starting all the way back at the very first entry, and ending with the most recent entry. But in order to understand Final Fantasy, we must first understand the history of its developer, Square Enix. Before Square Enix was the company they were today, they were actually two companies, Square Co. Limited and Enix Corporation. For the sake of the history of Final Fantasy, we'll focus on the former, Square, though you'll see Enix pop up a few times. Square was started in 1983 by Masafumi Miyamoto as a subsidiary of the Denyu Sha Electric Company, which was owned by Miyamoto's father. Back in 1983, video games tended to be developed by one person, but Miyamoto thought it would be best for both graphic designers and story writers to work together on common projects. When Nintendo released their Famicom, Square was reluctant to develop for the console, but ended up doing so anyway. In 1986, Square spun off from Denyu Sha and became Square Company Limited, or Squaresoft as they were more commonly known. However, the company was not doing well with selling games. While many of them were critical successes, they were unfortunately not financial successes. One developer, Hironobu Sakaguchi, offered to make an RPG after Enix, told you they'd pop up, released their critical and commercial success known as Dragon Quest. Sakaguchi was granted this request and began working on a game that took elements from Dragon Quest, but also took elements from Western RPGs Ultima and Wizardry. There was, however, another problem, besides Square's financial issues, and that was the fact that Sakaguchi was considered a rough boss to work with. In fact, Sakaguchi only had 3 people volunteer to work with him. Sakaguchi expected the game to be the last one he made and would go back to college considered a failure. However, in 1987, Square finally released Final Fantasy to the public. Now here's something some people ask a lot about the series. Why is it called Final Fantasy when there's been at least 30 games in the franchise? Many people will point out that this was meant to be Square's final game and that it was a fantasy RPG, mostly due to the fact that this is what the game's composer, Nobuo Uematsu, had stated. However, in 2015, Sakaguchi later explained that that isn't quite the case. The game was originally going to be called Fighting Fantasy, but there was a role-playing game book of the same name, so they had to change it. Sakaguchi didn't care what the name was, as long as it could be abbreviated as FF, which would sound good in Japanese as Efu Efu. I wouldn't be surprised if the possibility of the game being his last one was what helped that, but the game was never initially meant to be called Final Fantasy. Actually, Final Fantasy wasn't even Sakaguchi's first attempt at making an RPG. Originally, he had been working on a game known as Holy Sword Legend: The Emergence of Excalibur, or as it was known in Japanese, Seiken Densetsu. Square would eventually release a game under that title, but it had nothing to do with the original game. The reason it never got released was because Sakaguchi heavily overestimated the power of the Famicom, and so he ended up having to scrap it. However, Square offered to instead take any pre-orders people had made on Seiken Densetsu and use them towards pre-ordering Final Fantasy. So now, with all of this out of the way, let's finally take a look at the first entry in the series. The story of Final Fantasy is told to you right away. The world is ending! What, too brief for you? Okay, there's more to it than that. The world is going to hell in a handbasket because the 4 crystals are losing their power. The earth is decaying, the winds have died, and the seas are raging. How the seas are raging if there's no wind is beyond me, but whatever. This is happening because of the 4 elemental fiends, Lich, Merilith, Kraken, and Tiamat. The 4 of them are draining the power of the crystals so that they can give the power to their leader, the demon known as Chaos. However, a prophecy by the sage known as Lucan states that 4 heroes, each carrying the 4 crystals, will restore the light of the crystals and bring an end to the pain and suffering of the world. So, where are these 4 heroes? Why, right outside of Castle Cornelia, of course. When you start up a new game, you have to create a party of 4. The game doesn't tell you the names, backstories, or personalities of the characters, so you can make them yourself if you really care about that kind of thing. There are 6 classes you can choose from for each character, and you can even have multiples of the same class. The first class of choice is the warrior. He's essentially the powerhouse of the group. He can tank hits like nobody's business and whoop any enemy that comes within an arm's length of him. The thief is a bit faster than the warrior and isn't quite as hard hitting, but he has pretty decent luck all things considered, as well as having a better chance of escaping battles. There's the monk, who can fight barehanded and can end up just as powerful as the knight without needing to spend as much, though starts fairly weak. The black mage is pathetically weak offensively and defensively, but excels in using black magic to harm enemies. The white mage has pretty decent HP, but has pretty much no offense or defense. The white mage is essentially your healer, with the exception of a couple spells that can do harm, even if it is only to a select few enemy types. And finally, the red mage is the standard jack of all trades. He's able to use powerful weapons and armor, and can learn both black and white magic spells. Originally, I went with a team of a warrior, thief, white mage, and black mage, which tends to be the most favored. However, I decided instead to live stream the game and had 4 of the viewers choose their names and class. So instead we have King the Warrior, Young the Monk, Vic the Black Mage, and Nana the White Mage. With the team assembled, we head into Cornelia Castle, where the king asks us to get back his daughter, the princess, from the evil knight Garland. Garland was once a faithful knight to the kingdom, but then one day he just suddenly turned evil and no one knows why. We can find him to the northwest at the Chaos Shrine. Before we go, however, we'll have to buy some equipment and then level ourselves up. Thankfully, there's a weapons shop, an armor shop, and a magic shop of both schools located in Cornelia itself. To buy these things, however, we'll need gold pieces, and the only way to get those right now is to grind for them. Thankfully, we'll have enough to buy weapons so our team isn't going in with their bare fists. Although admittedly, when I was first recording the gameplay of this, I forgot to equip weapons for the group because of how the interface worked against me. When buying a piece of equipment, you have to select who will wield the equipment that you bought. However, the game made it look like it was going to equip the items for me. So yeah, you can see where I screwed up. Thankfully, this is fixed in later versions. Moving on, after we get all the money we need, as well as leveling up and buying all the necessary stuff we need, we finally head to the Chaos Shrine. Inside, we can find a leather cap on the left side of the shrine. The rooms on the right side, however, are locked by something known as the Mystic Key, as are the treasury rooms in Cornelia. We'll get to those later, though. Going into the center of the shrine, we find Garland surrounded by bats and standing in front of the princess as he gives off one of the most memorable lines in Final Fantasy. I, Garland, will knock you all down. That line is one of the best lines on the NES, to be honest. It's too bad that Garland himself is a pushover. The guy goes down very quickly. Well, I might as well use this time to talk about the combat. When you get into battle, you have 5 options: fight, magic, drink, item, and run. Fight causes you to use the character's weapon to attack. Magic lets you cast a spell that the character knows. Drink lets you use a potion to heal one of the fighters, either by giving them health or healing the poison status condition. Item lets you use a weapon or armor piece, which may or may not work depending on the item. And finally, run makes you try to run away. You enter the commands for each of the 4 characters, and when you're finished, they go through the turn order alongside the enemies. Enemies can appear in up to groups of 9, though bigger enemies like giants limit how many can appear. If you see Chance to Strike First when you enter combat, then that means you get a whole free turn to do whatever you want while the enemies are screwed. However, if you see Monsters Strike First, then that means the enemies get the turn advantage on you. The combat system is pretty simple, but it's effective. But there are 2 big issues with it. The first is a glitch that I think wasn't fixed until the remake on the PlayStation. Whenever multiple characters target an enemy, and the enemy dies before everyone who targeted them is gone, the attacks of those who still targeted it completely whiff, making you waste your turn. While this can be an issue, I found it was actually helpful once I started to work around it, since it helps you to pay attention to battles, thus keeping them from being simple mashes of the A button. The other issue, however, is not helpful at all, and that's the magic system. Because the magic system is borrowed from Dungeons & Dragons, you only have a certain number of charges for each level of magic. The only ways to recharge this are to sleep at an inn or to use a house, an item that restores charges and heals you. The latter option, however, is rather expensive and can only be used outside, and so most of the time you'll be using magic during boss fights only. With Garland defeated, we walk over to the princess and wake her up, and suddenly we skip ahead to having gotten back to Cornelia Castle. The king there says that he'll tell his workers to finish repairing the bridge outside for us so that we can continue on our journey. The princess also gives us something. A lute. Seems pretty pathetic for a reward, huh? Oh, this is kind of how NES RPGs tended to work, sadly. With that, we head across the bridge and into the title screen with one of the most memorable moments in the franchise's history. The music that plays here, considered the theme of Final Fantasy, has been used in almost every Final Fantasy game since this. It's also a scene that has become iconic to the series. After the game details what will happen, you get the opening credits like in a movie. And then we move on. One of the NPCs in Cornelia hinted that we should head east to the town of Provoca, so that's where our next goal is. When we get to Provoca, we find out that the town has been overrun by pirates. Oh no! Well, good thing they've got plenty of stores around to buy stuff. Unfortunately, we'll need to do a lot more grinding yet again. This is unfortunately something we'll have to do a lot. Grinding is almost painstakingly necessary until we get to the dungeon with the first fiend in it, and so expect to do it a lot. Once we've got everything, we can go and challenge the pirate captain known as Bick. He sends his crew to fight the team, who immediately mops the floor with the pirate crew. Without a crew, Bick surrenders to you and gives you his pirate ship. Huzzah! Talking to the citizens, one tells you that you can head to the west and find the land of Elfheim, so that's our next stop. In addition, we can sail to the north and find the cave of the witch known as Matoya. She is unfortunately completely blind without her crystal eye, so she can't really help us. In the meantime, talking to the brooms has them give you a strange coded message. What does this mean? Well, when you go outside and hold down the select button while pressing B, the game will pull up the world map. You can't zoom in on it, and your only indicator of where you are is some little crosshair, but once you start getting an idea of where you're going, you'll find the map to be very useful. There's also another neat little trick that I have to thank YouTuber Clement J64 for pointing out in his review of this game that I didn't know about before. When you're on the pirate ship, press A and B together 55 times, or hold down A and press B 30 times, and you'll get to play the 15 puzzle minigame. If you complete it, you'll get 100 gold, though you get better rewards when you complete this game in later versions. If you keep sailing, you'll come across a cave that's home to a bunch of dwarfs. One dwarf mentions that if he had adamantine, he could forge the most powerful weapon in the world. Another says that if he had TNT, he could blow up a mountain and connect the small lake we're in to the ocean. Eventually, as you sail, you'll get to Elfheim. Going into the city, you can find more stuff, including both level 3 and level 4 spells. This is also the only town in the game where you can buy softs, which are helpful items that cure petrification. There's also a reference to Dragon Quest in this city. If you go north of the entrance, you'll see a set of 3 gravestones, and checking the one all the way to the left will read, "Here lies Erdrick." Erdrick happens to be a warrior of legend in the original Dragon Quest, and in Dragon Quest III he's a playable character. In the PS1 remake, the gravestone reads, "May Erdrick rest in peace." But in the original Japanese version for both games, as well as the remakes afterwards, the gravestone instead reads, "Here lies Link." Yeah, as in Link from The Legend of Zelda. I just realized that I released this video the same year Breath of the Wild came out. Yikes. Well, anyway, going into the castle, we find out that the prince has been put under a sleeping spell by Astos, the dark elf who wishes to conquer the kingdom of Elfheim. Supposedly, Matoya has an herb she can use to wake up the prince. But to get it, we need to get back her eye. Which means we need to find that eye. And fast. If you head west, you'll find a keep that's home to a king who claims that Astos placed a curse on him that kept him locked in the castle that has bats flying everywhere. Yeah, he's totally not a bad guy. Anyway, the king says the only way to break the curse is to bring the elf's crown to him. One problem. The crown is currently in the Marsh Cave. One of 2 dungeons in this game that I dreaded going into. The Marsh Cave is the first of the dungeons I like to call dungeons of extreme annoyance and testing hatred. Or death. These dungeons are dungeons that tend to be extremely difficult or extremely annoying. Even more so than usual. The Marsh Cave is one of them. First of all, this place has a lot of stuff that you will want to take with you, whether it's gold or equipment items. Second, there are several enemies in this dungeon that can attack you and either stun you, which can take turns to heal from and leaves you a sitting duck, or poison you. which you can't get rid of unless you use an antidote. And these enemies are everywhere! They'll become more common once you leave, but when you first enter here, you might have 1, maybe 2 antidotes at best. Once you leave, you'll definitely learn to buy them just like potions, but you will not be prepared when you first enter this dungeon unless you know what's going to happen. The crown, as well as a few other chests in this dungeon, also happen to be guarded by Pisca demons, which come out in groups of 2 to 4 and cannot be run from. And they're annoying as hell to fight too if you have magic users, since their magic defense is through the roof and they resist fire and ice magic. Hell, they resist the Dia spell too, starting in the GBA version. So yeah, this place is not fun. And what's even worse is that this dungeon has items locked away behind the Mystic Key, so you'll have to wait until you get that and come back here again! Ugh, whatever. We get the crown and bring it to the king, and shock of all shocks, he's really Astos himself. And he reveals this to us before we give him the crown. What an idiot! Astos, though, is a rather challenging boss. Unlike Garland, Astos puts up a fight, though still not too much of one in my opinion. Sure, it's rather time-consuming, but it isn't a total pain like some of the later bosses. Astos likes to use the death spell to kill off one of your party members easily, and it's rather random whether or not it works. If it does, you'll be down a player, but if you're careful, you'll be able to beat down Astos without them, even if it is your healer. He'll try to cast other spells too, but usually he can be defeated before that happens, so you'll be fine. When we defeat Astos, we get the Crystal Eye. By taking it to Matoya's cave, we get the herb from her, needed to wake up the Elf Prince. And when we go back to the Prince and wake him up, we get the Mystic Key from him. With this key, we can open literally any door in the world. While there are plenty of doors that are locked exclusively by the key, there's TNT behind a locked door in Cornelia Castle that we definitely need. By giving it to the dwarf that mentioned it in the Dwarven Cavern, he'll blow a hole in the land that will act as a canal out of the lake. Now we can head to more towns. The closest town would be Melman to the east. But when we get there, it's clear that the earth is decaying. Talking to the villagers, they say that Melmond is the closest town to the Earth Cavern, so as a result, the earth is decaying there much earlier than it would in other places. The town's clinic and item shop were also destroyed thanks to a vampire, so if we want to bring characters back to life, we'd have to go back to Elfheim or possibly even further. Same with items. So once again, time for grinding. There's also a man named Dr. Un in the town, and he says he's well known. Well, I've never heard of this guy before. There's a farmer here too. Okay. Weird. When the group heads to the west, they can head down the Devil's Tail Peninsula to the Cavern of Earth. This place is a huge maze, a frustrating one as well. If one heads west when they enter, you'll end up fighting nothing but giants at every step. If one wanted to, they could go near there to gain some levels, but go at your own risk. When you get to the third floor, you can fight the vampire. He's pretty easy since all it takes is fire and or Dia to kill him. Once you're done, you can head back outside and farther west to the Giant's Cave. Go farther than that, and you'll find the Sage's Cavern, and inside is a man named Sada. He mentions that although the vampire was destroyed, the true Fiend of Earth still lives. He then hands you a rod to place on the pedestal in the vampire's chamber. So when you go there, you're given access to another floor that— God damn it, it's another maze! And again, there are plenty of enemies down here that can poison you. Even worse is that there are cockatrices on some of the upper floors which can petrify you, so if you didn't buy softs, you were screwed. It's not a frustrating dungeon like the Marsh Cave, it's just tedious and time-consuming. Eventually, when you do get to the Fiend, you have your first boss fight with one of the major villains of the game, Lich. Aw man, the first of the 4 Fiends. If he's powerful enough to drain the light of the crystals, who knows what he's capable of? He's gotta be really powerful and— Never mind. Yeah, Lich is a pretty easy boss, all things considered, especially if you have Dia 3 and Fire 3. In fact, all the bosses, with the exception of the final boss, tend to be pretty easy when you fight them. This is mainly because the original Final Fantasy isn't about grueling boss fights or conditions that you have to go through in order to fight properly. The difficulty of the game comes from how you handle yourself in a dungeon. The bosses, for the most part, are really easy. It's the journey there that makes fighting them such a challenge. The Earth Cavern is a good example. The dungeon is filled with many undead enemies which are all weak to fire and light magic, so getting through the dungeons is easy. But then if you use up all your charges, you'll have no way to properly fight Lich without going through an arduous battle that may end up taking at least one of your party members out of commission. It's less of a dungeon and more of a gauntlet that tests your endurance and patience. Sure, you could use Fire 3 to wipe out all those enemies, but are you sure you don't want to save those for Lich? Sure, you could heal yourself with Cure 2, but what if the boss ends up beating one of your characters down and you don't have enough charges to save them? You have to consider whether or not using a spell or healing potion is really worth it now, or if you think you can hold off until the boss. Fortunately, the game gives you plenty of money and things to sell for money that can allow you to buy a bunch of potions, so you can at least use those, even though they don't heal you for much and you have to go back farther than Melman to buy them. Moving on, once Lich is defeated, the light is restored to the Earth Crystal. If you head back to the ship, your next stop is a town known as Crescent Lake, where the enemies start getting tougher than just ogres and great imps. When you go inside, you'll start finding out that there are some spells your mages can't learn. Why don't we fix that? When you go to the top right of the town, you'll find the Circle of Sages, who will tell you more information about the Four Fiends. Oh, and hey, we even found Lucom, the guy who made the prophecy about us. One of the sages tells you that because you defeated Lich, the Fiend of Fire, known as Merilith, has woken up 500 years early, and so he gives you a canoe, which is the only way you can reach the Mount Gold volcano. However, if you go back in the pirate ship, you can follow the coast until you reach a river. The canoe can only be used to travel on rivers, and you can go right onto a river if you sail up to it with the pirate ship, so you no longer have to look for harbors in order to get out of the ship. Eventually, as you follow along the river, you'll reach the Ice Cavern. This is another death dungeon. Much like the Marsh Cave, there are plenty of enemies in this place that can inflict stun and poison, but there are also enemies that can use petrification. But even more annoying are the Dark Wizards and Mind Flayers. What makes these two annoying? How about the fact that they can kill you instantly without fail? Dark Wizards cast the Death Spell, and Mind Flayer's basic attack only deals 1 point of damage to everyone, but there's a chance that it can kill you instantly. Other than those two though, all the other enemies are weak to fire elemental attacks, and conveniently, this dungeon also contains the Flame Sword. There's also Ice Armor, which actually protects you from fire elemental attacks. It seems like the developers anticipated that you might go here first, so it's a good way to do sequence breaking. This is something a lot of Final Fantasy games will do very well later on, allowing you to become more powerful for a short time if you're willing to suffer with some intense difficulty. When I originally recorded the footage for this review, my warrior Zess was the only one left alive in the middle of the dungeon, and he made it through the rest of the place on his own. The boss of this dungeon is the Evil Eye, which was originally the Beholder from Dungeons & Dragons. Beat it and get into the nearby chest, and you'll find the Levystone. What does it do? You'll see. You then have to go to the bottom floor of the dungeon again before you can get out. Once you're done there, as well as the healing you will absolutely need to do once you're done with the place, go back down from the coast from Crescent Lake, and you will see a river near a desert. Go into the desert and activate the Levystone, and you'll be rewarded with the legendary airship. At this point, life becomes 3 times better with this thing, since not only can you go to anywhere you want in the game without needing to stop at a harbor, but you also have 0 random encounters. How awesome is that? But in the meantime, let's go fix that problem I mentioned before. Head north to an archipelago and land on one of the islands and go in the hole in the ground, and you will find dragons. These are the Dragon Isles, home to the good dragons. In one hole, you'll find the throne room of the King of the Dragons, Bahamut. He says that if the party proves themselves to be men of courage, he will grant them a gift. How do we prove this? Well, we must complete the Citadel of Trials. The Citadel of Trials is a sort of weird maze thing. In order to get through the dungeon, you have to go to these pillars. Each pillar is actually a teleporter that takes you to a different part of the floor. Most rooms only have one teleporter, but some have multiple, and in those rooms you have to find the correct teleporter or get sent back a distance. It's not difficult, it's just tedious. The enemies aren't even that much of a challenge since most of them are undead, so the Flame Sword works wonders on them. There are a lot of chests in here too with cool weapons and armor pieces, including the gauntlets, which cast lightning too when used as items. Also in one of the chests is a rat's tail. The way to show Bahamut that we are courageous is a rat's tail? Maybe it's to see if we have the courage to hold on to the damn thing until we get back to him without vomiting. At the end of the dungeon is a sudden encounter with zombie dragons, and they're easy as hell. Again, the Flame Sword makes quick work of them. Once we defeat them, we can get back to Bahamut. Bahamut says that we are indeed courageous warriors, and so he gives everyone a class upgrade. The warrior and thief become the knight and ninja respectively, which function similarly to one another. They can equip more powerful weapons and armor pieces, but the big upgrade is that they can now use magic up to level 4, with the warrior able to use certain white magic spells and the ninja able to use certain black magic spells. The monk becomes a master, which makes him even more powerful in terms of stats. And the 3 mages each become wizards, able to learn more powerful spells as well as equip more weapons and armor too. With this, we can go back to both Melmond and Crescent Lake and get spells we couldn't normally get before. What I love about this upgrade is just how jacked up all the heroes get. They go from tiny little kids to freaking Arnold Schwarzenegger Mr. Universe contestants. And with that, we're off to stop the next fiend. Our next stop is Mount Gulg, which we can only reach via a river near Crescent Lake, much like the Ice Cavern. And guess what? It's a freaking volcano! A dormant one, yes, but it's still got lava in it. Lava that our heroes actually have to move through in order to get through the place. Yes, in order to save the world, our 4 heroes have to wade through molten magma inside of a dormant volcano. I can only imagine what the thought process was like. Hey, maybe the lava's only boiling instead of molten because the lava squares only deal 1 point of damage to you. This dungeon has a lot of chests in it too, particularly on the 2nd floor. And of course, since this is the fire dungeon, ice spells work wonders on it. The flame sword quickly gets replaced with the ice sword, and if you got the ice armor in the ice cavern, it'll make going through this place much easier for your warrior. Eventually you'll get to the bottom floor, which is a giant screw you to anyone that also likes looking for treasure in these dungeons. There are 8 paths, 6 of which lead to rooms that have absolutely nothing in them. In other words, they're complete wastes of time and resources. One of the paths leads to some chests that actually have stuff in them. The final path leads to the Fiend of Fire herself, Merilith. And she's easy as hell, just like Lich. Granted, Merilith is faster, so it's possible she'll kill at least one of your party members before you get her, but she's still easy to take down overall. Alright, let's move on. Our next stop is the town of Onrak, which requires a long walk because of how far away it is from the closest landing spot for the airship. This town has some level 7 magic for you to choose from as well if you want. Going to the southeast section of town, a woman says that she's created a submarine to visit the Sunken Shrine, which is the home of the mermaids as well as where the Fiend of Water, Kraken, is residing. However, in order for it to work, the warriors need something called Oxyale, which is only found in the town of Gaia. Before that, however, our heroes are told that someone said that they saw a robot flying into the waterfall nearby. Let's go check it out! Going into the river and going north, we can find the Waterfall Cavern. It's a sort of mini dungeon that you need to go to, but there's no real boss to worry about. The enemies are pretty easy to beat, so it's just finding your way through. Eventually, the group comes across a robot who gives them the Warp Cube, which will be necessary when we go up against the final fiend. Anyway, let's go get the Oxyale. We head to Gaia, which is in a little clearing surrounded by mountains, only to find out that the fairy that lives on the lake where Oxyale can be found has been captured, and that only she is able to get the stuff. We also find that a pirate in town captured the fairy and sold it to a desert caravan that happens to be near Onrak. So we go over to the desert caravan and find that the fairy costs 50,000 gold pieces! Holy crap, that's a steep price to pay just to move on. Well, you know what this calls for. More grinding! Yeah, you didn't think you'd have to do any more of that, did you? Once you get the fairy, you can go back to Gaia. By the way, Gaia also has some level 7 magic. In fact, the magic is split in half between it and Onrak. There's also level 8 spells, but each one of them has an option missing. We'll get to where to find those soon enough. One of the spells to get is a white magic spell known as Holy. It's one of the only white magic spells in the game that can deal damage, the others being the Dia family of spells. However, Holy's big difference, besides being more powerful, is that it can work on more than just undead enemies. So yeah, I'd say it's worth it. When you go to the lake at the north side of town and free the fairy, she thanks you for saving her and gets you Oxyale. When you return to Onrak, the woman guarding the submarine reveals herself as the spirit of a mermaid who died at the hands of Kraken and allows you to use the submarine. The Sunken Shrine is a unique dungeon. Rather than starting on the topmost or bottommost floor, you instead start in the middle of the dungeon. On the top floor are a group of mermaids that you can talk to and tell you about how Kraken destroyed their home. There are no encounters on this floor, and instead, you can find rooms filled with treasure chests, one of which contains the Rosetta Stone. One of the NPCs in Onrak mentioned that someone named Dr. Un is actually looking for this item, and if you remember, I mentioned Dr. Un is in the town of Melmond. We'll get this to him later. The dungeon is more of an endurance test more than anything. Most of the enemies are easy to get rid of, especially with lightning spells, but they'll start wearing you down if you're not careful. Eventually, you'll get to Kraken, who can seem like a pushover, but if you're not careful, he'll hit like a truck even to your upgraded classes. He's also pretty tanky, so it might take more than just one turn to take him out, even with the Lightning Force spell. Still, he goes down fast enough, and sure enough, you'll get the Water Crystal restored. With that, we're brought back to Onrak. We have one fiend left. First stop we need to make is Melmond, where you have to talk to Dr. Un. He's so excited about getting the Rosetta Stone from you that he actually teaches you Lufenian, the language of the Lufenine. Now that you know Lufenian, you can go to Lufenia. Going inside, they'll tell you of how they once had a giant fortress up in the sky, but now it is home to Tiamat, the Fiend of Wind and Queen of the Evil Dragons, who expelled them all. This city is also home to magic shops that hold the last black and white magic spells in the game, Flare and Life 2, although I prefer Flare's NES name, Nuke. It sounds cooler. So now you have both Flare and Holy, the two most powerful spells in the game. Let's go restore that last crystal. The entrance to Tiamat's lair is, ironically, located in the desert. You'd expect that would be Lich's home, but oh well. There's a large desert that has a giant spiraling tower called Mirage Tower. This is actually a two-part dungeon. The first part is the Mirage Tower itself, which is short and straightforward. The second part of the dungeon is the Flying Fortress. It's a giant fortress up in space. This part is pretty straightforward as well, with more treasure chests to open on the first 3 floors, one of the chests containing adamantine. The 4th floor is where it gets complicated. It's a giant infinite loop that will send you running in circles. The best way I've found to get from the entrance of the floor to the exit is going up 2 crossroads, and to the left 2 crossroads, and you'll get to the 5th floor. Sadly, I wish I could show footage of a fun secret on this floor, but I unfortunately was not able to get footage. So instead, I sadly have to borrow footage instead. On the 5th floor, there's a 1 out of 64 chance of encountering a monster known as the War Mech. This is the first example of a super boss in the series. The boss not only has a ton of health, but it resists all 3 elements. It also has the ability to nuke the party, dealing massive damage to everyone. It's a tough boss, often considered on par with the final boss of the game, so it's not to be taken lightly. With that out of the way, let's move on to the actual boss of the dungeon, Tiamat. Being a wind elemental boss, Tiamat has no weaknesses, so you'll have to rely on your skill to beat her. Tiamat can hit hard, and you'll likely lose a party member or 2 in the fight, but eventually, if you're careful, she'll go down. With that out of the way, we restore the Wind Crystal. We're done, right? Nope! If you head back to the Circle of Sages at Crystal Lake, the sages tell you that someone has gone 2,000 years into the past, back to the source of the evil, and that you have to return to the Chaos Shrine. While you're in Crescent Lake, I highly recommend getting the teleport spell since you'll need it for the final dungeon. If you got the adamantine, you can bring it to the dwarf who wanted it, and give it to him for him to forge a new weapon, Excalibur. Excalibur is only able to be equipped to the Knight class, but it's an incredibly useful weapon since it exploits any and all weaknesses, and it's the most powerful weapon in the original version, and one of the most powerful even in the remakes. With that, we can go to the Chaos Shrine and begin the final battle. When we go back to the shrine, we can go into the chamber where we fought Garland and look into his crystal ball to go 2,000 years back in time. But be warned, without the teleport spell I mentioned earlier, you can't leave the dungeon. So if you didn't get it, make sure you are well stocked before you go in. The old Chaos Shrine is easily the longest and toughest dungeon in the game. There are enemies all over, and the place is a giant maze. But it's at least a fair dungeon. It doesn't just pile on enemy after enemy that can inflict status conditions, but rather spaces them out. Most of the fights are tough, but a well-prepared player can get out of them with minimal damage. Throughout the dungeon, you'll rematch against the 4 fiends, but this time they've been upgraded. This includes Lich, who should be made even tougher, but I was able to take him down in 1 turn. The other fiends go down pretty quickly as well, even Tiamat. On one of the floors, you'll find the Masamune, which is a unique weapon because it can be equipped to any class in the game, even a monk and master. Though why you'd want to, I have no idea, since they're more than powerful without it and it actually makes them weaker. So we fight our way through the 4 fiends again and make it to the bottom floor. So now we can battle our final opponent. Finally, we get to fight the one who is responsible for all of the destruction and the 4 fiends. We finally get to battle! Garland? Wait, but we killed him. How is he still alive? Well, it turns out that the 4 fiends actually sent him back in time before we defeated him. He then sent the 4 fiends into the future, and the cycle continued over and over, and caused Garland to gain more and more power in a 2,000-year time loop. And as a result, he gained so much power that he's transformed into the Demon Lord himself, Chaos. Of course, Chaos is supposed to be the toughest opponent in the game, but a well-prepared player like me is able to take him down quickly. I defeated him in 3 turns with the right spells and enough physical beating from King and Young. So much for the most powerful demon in the world, I guess. And with that, the world is saved. The time loop was closed, so Garland was made no longer evil, and everyone has been saved. But no one in the world knew of the hero's exploits. The world was safe from evil, and the game ends with a giant, fancy-looking The End. All in all, Final Fantasy is an incredibly fun game, but I honestly would recommend playing the remakes of the game. The PSP and iOS versions of the game are the best, but I would also recommend the GBA remake as well. Not only do they have upgrades and beautiful looking graphics, but they also fix many of the bugs of the game. They feel more in line with the later games in the series, plus the GBA and PSP iOS games also add new dungeons that are all fun challenge. Actually, the remakes themselves can be considered more challenging since the bosses have much more health. If you're doing some historical research on gaming and the franchise kind of like I am, then I could see playing the NES version, but otherwise the remakes are much better games. Story-wise, the game is okay. It's a simple story, but it's pretty cool anyway. The customization is very fun, and the twist of Garland being both the first and last boss of the game is very welcome, but otherwise the NES version is nothing to write home about. Overall, it's a good game, and I can definitely see why this game brought back Square from the brink of destruction. Even if it needs a lot of polish only the remakes was able to provide. It did its job, though, and turned Square into a household name. At least in Japan. In the US, it made them notable, but not as famous as they were in their home country. With a successful game under their belt, a sequel was no doubt likely to happen, but little did anyone know that the sequel would be just around the corner. We'll talk about that sequel next time when we discuss the Evil Empire and the Wild Rose Rebellion in Final Fantasy II.